On the 60th anniversary of the Munich Air Disaster, we thought it was more important than ever that fans' memories of the tragic event and what it means to the club lives on for future generations of new Manchester United fans to understand for years to come. Here are their words.
That's why it became such a memory to people of my age, because they were approachable. They actually lived among you, which is what you don't see now. Nobody lives among the supporters now, obviously. They're all multi-millionaires, but in those days, you're quite liable to jump on a bus with Bobby Charlton and Duncan Edwards travelling through from Charlton up to here to start training. That was quite likely. The ground itself was always a mega crowd. Every time you went, it was always full. Like the last time I seen the actual Busby Babes in their entirety was we played Bolton. That was the last home game we played here. We beat them 6-0, 6-1, I think, something like that. I was down at school when at that time my daddy used to pick me up and run me to the ground from his workplace in Metrovix down in the Old Trafford. He used to meet me at the United Cafe. We'd walk down, he'd get me in early, get me to the front. And nobody went to the toilet, nothing in them days. You had to pee where you were and smoke where you were. I mean, there was nothing romantic about it, but it was just the way things were in those days. It was a big occasion. It was a working classes ballet, as it were. It's a big occasion for every working man, every kid at school. The big occasion was the match. And Manchester United had more than their fair share of supporters during that time. So it was a big occasion. They were like players you thought you could reach out and touch. They weren't much older than ourselves at the time.
On the day of the crash, which was February the 6th, 1958, I think I got home from school, and I do vaguely remember my mother mentioning to me that there'd been a very bad accident and a plane had crashed, and some footballers who had probably just heard a little bit about at that age, quite a number of people have been killed, and it would be a sad time. That was my first sort of knowledge of the crash. From then on, more and more people like myself became interested in Manchester United. My father was the sort of instigator, if you like. He was always a fanatic from many years back, and he was particularly keen on the Busby Babe team that had just previously won the two league championships in 55-56 and 56-57. I remember him telling me that he'd gone to the cup final in 57 when they lost slightly controversially to Aston Villa.
I've stood next to them, I've spoke to them at Newton Heath Loco, Charlton, Edwards, Tommy Taylor, people like that, and they were just there, just lads. And I think that's why the Munich disaster hit us so hard. Myself, my dad had been like his early 30s at that time, so he'd only a relatively young man. A lot of young people it would have affected, people my age now, and people older than me. It would have affected really, really hard.
They'd made progress in the European Cup for the second year running, and in 1957-58 they were semi-finalists for the second time in a row, and were due to play AC Milan in the semi-final. Having got to the quarter-final, they had played Red Star Belgrade, and they got through on the second leg in Belgrade with a 3-3 draw, which meant they went through 5-4 in aggregate. What happened after that, of course, is that they flew from Belgrade to Munich, and the weather was pretty bad, and they had a refuelling stop there, and they twice attempted to take off, and each time the pilot aborted the takeoff. He couldn't get the wheels off the ground, there was snow on the runway, and they went back to the terminal building.
On the day of the disaster, I was at Severian College at the time in Rusham, and I was living in Moston, so I used to have to get the bus from the college into town, into Piccadilly. I got the 42 bus, and I drove into Manchester. And you always looked at the billboards, because that was your only means of any kind of news. You're always looking for football news, and the evening news billboards, evening cron billboards. And the first thing I seen when I got into town was the Manchester United air disaster. And I didn't have a clue what that related to. I didn't have a clue the repercussions that were there. I just thought, what is it? What is it? I mean, you couldn't get news in those days. It's not like instant media these days where you know the news before it's actually happened half the time.
So the third attempt to take off was launched. But unfortunately, the plane never left the ground. What happened was that the pilot put all his force and thrust into trying to lift the plane off, but he couldn't make it. He couldn't abort the attempt this time, and the plane crashed through a fence, crossed the road, hit a building and broke up. And unfortunately, there was a building attached to it where there was a fuel dump as well, which made matters even worse. And part of the aircraft was exploded. And of course, within a few minutes, it was clear that there was terrible carnage there. The emergency vehicles arrived and they took quite as many, obviously the injured, hospital straight away, but there was already many deaths. 21 people actually died more or less on the spot.
So it basically, you were trying to pick a paper up, you couldn't buy a paper, you were just running home with your school bag. But obviously there was huddles of people all around Piccadilly at that time, all around John Lewis Arcade. The older people will remember that place. They were stood around talking about it, and it basically, at the time they said it's a wipeout, there's no survivors, they're all dead. It was just horrible feeling at the time. But obviously it was later on when we got home and my dad came home from work with the paper and we started reading the paper, and we're trying to get any kind of news we can on the TV, but it's in Germany, which then it might as well have been in Australia for the time it took to get news from it. You had people talking in broken English from Munich and telling you what was what. And then when the actual list started to come out of the people who died, it was like a punch in the stomach. It was just, you couldn't believe that young lads like that, you were never going to see them again. You'd only seen them 2 weeks previously. You'd seen them when they played Arsenal, and they beat Arsenal 5-3 down at Highbury. That was the last game in England. And you'd seen all these pictures, and all these pictures were in your head, and that was all you could see, those young lads. Well, young men, to me, I was only a young lad myself. Those young men, you were never going to see them again. Playing football for Manchester United, which was your team, it was their team. It was Matt Busby's team, who was really ill in hospital, not expected to live. You had Duncan Edwards, who was struck down, and there was hope that Duncan would have lived. But obviously, the kidney problems he had, it just overtook him. Even if he'd have survived, he wouldn't have been the same man. He couldn't have played football, and that wouldn't have suited Duncan because he was always the leader. He wanted to play football. He wanted to do the whole thing.
From there, Manchester United obviously had to rebuild. They'd lost 8 out of the 17 players. In fact, 10 in all, because two players survived but never played again. Jackie Blanchard and Johnny Berry. So they were decimated, and they didn't play any more games for about 3 weeks. They played Sheffield Wednesday in an FA Cup tie at Old Trafford, and obviously that was one of the most emotional matches that could ever be. And with basically a scratch team, they managed to beat Sheffield Wednesday 3-0 and get through to the 6th round of the FA Cup. In fact, they went on that season to reach the final and lost 2-0 to Bolton Wanderers, again controversially, when Harry Gregg, the goalkeeper, was charged into the net by Nat Lofthouse.
You had like a 2-week lull from the event, so we had the Sheffield Wednesday game with a blank programme, so we started making progress in the cup, till we had Bobby Charlton come back from injury, from the crash injuries. You had Harry Gregg coming back, you had Bill Foltz coming back, but after that it was all kids. It was just a team of kids, and people could beg, borrow or steal. And then obviously, when it's like a death in the family, when you think you've lost a family member and you're sad and you're upset at the time, but when you come to the funeral time of it, it hits you again. And like 20 days after the event, Duncan Edwards succumbed to his injuries and died. It just kicked it all over again. So it was a very, very sad time. And I've said in the past, it was like a black and white period. There was no colour, there was no light. It's just a horrible time to be alive.
But Sir Matt Busby himself was, shall we say, very fortunate, having been read the last rites on 2 occasions, to survive, and he at one time was quite adamant that he wasn't going to continue as manager, but eventually he did decide to carry on, and he had to obviously try and rebuild the club with all the sympathy that was going on around the world and everything, and it took really 5 years till they won the FA Cup in 1963, and the start of another golden era with players like George Best, Bobby Charlton, who was a survivor of the crash, and in fact one of the only 2 survivors with Harry Gregg today.
A slow process, obviously, because they ripped the team out. The whole team had been ripped out of the club, basically. International players, experienced players, world-class players. And it's a lot of people to try and replace it. Obviously, it took time, but Busby took that on board. But I will say, prior to Busby coming back to the club, we had the FA Cup final, which was down probably to Jimmy Murphy, he was enormous in the actual rebuild of this club. Let's not underestimate what Jimmy Murphy done for this club. It was tremendous. So when we played the FA Cup final, the actual club badge was at the Phoenix, rising from the Ashes. We got beat by Bolton again, their old nemesis, that Lofthouse and all. The following season, we actually finished second in the league, but we were never going to win the league. It was just we were carried forward in emotion.
And they managed to bring another great team forward, and they won the championship in 1965 and in 1967, and then of course the greatest triumph of all, finally to win the European Cup at Wembley on May the 29th, 1968.
A legendary player, I couldn't believe we signed Dennis Law, something like, now I can't believe we signed Sanchez. I couldn't believe we signed Dennis Law from Italy. We missed out on him going to City again. There's anomalies there again. He went to City when we thought we were going to get him. We went and signed him to City from Huddersfield. He was there a year, having a look round it, thought, no, it's not for me. He went to Italy. And then when Busby came to pick him up, he couldn't get back quick enough. So he had Busby there, he had Bobby Charlton coming into his prime. On the periphery of that, you had young George Best starting to look the part. We had a young keeper, David Gaskell, who again probably came through too quick. We had to lose him, but we did win the FA Cup. I was in the army at the time. I was in Germany. There was a lot of Scousers there, a lot of all kinds of fans there who weren't Man United fans, and I took all kinds of bets everywhere that we'd beat Leicester, which is just well we did. I'd have been hot still, but we beat Leicester. But prior to the Leicester game, because Leicester were massive favourites, I remember speaking to my dad. He said, I can't believe this. He said they'd done like Sports View, this would be a midweek programme, Sports View, and they actually took them at the Leicester captain up the Wembley steps, Frank McClintock it was, to say this is where you'll stand and turn around and show the cup. I think our telly was lucky to get out of the room alive that night, the television, the old fellow's foot might have gone through it. But that was how confident that the media were that we wouldn't win that cup final, but we did. I mean, we didn't just win it, we won it really well. And that was basically the start of our 3 or 4 years, which took us on to the 68 final. It was a steady step of building.
Well, when I was 10, we won the European Cup at Wembley that night, and obviously it was on the news, all talking about the Munich Air Disaster and what it meant for Matt Busby, because they called Matt Busby down onto the pitch to walk round with the cup. That's what it meant. They knew that night in 68 when we won it for the first time. You knew what the Munich Air Disaster meant to the fans, the players.
And that was really the pinnacle of everything, to sort of win it 10 years later in memory of those glorious boys who lost their lives in the crash. I did attend the European Cup final against Benfica in May 1968, and that was one of those unforgettable occasions, and obviously the emotion was incredibly high that evening, and anybody that was there will never forget that particular game. Even with the other European Cup triumphs that we've had since, that perhaps was the greatest one, that reached the goal that they always had in mind. On the night they had that little bit extra to offer, and Benfica, as good as they were a really top team in the 60s, were really swept aside in extra time. And as I say, the emotion, people were just in tears, hugging each other, and particularly for the older ones who can go back to 58 and recall the tragedy and how those boys had just been cruelly deprived.
So Matt Busby, God rest him, eventually reached his holy grail, and that was 10 years after Munich. So it was a big step, it was a big night. I was at Wembley that night. I was fortunate enough to be there with like 20 handed that night. I think went down in a bus, a couple of buses, a couple of cars. Had a game of football in Hyde Park. I'd like to see us do that now. Went to the final, danced out the ground, danced around the ground. It took us 3 days to get home. We made a long, slow journey home. I think it was Friday afternoon before we got home, Saturday morning, I can't remember. But it was just a wonderful time to be alive. And it was just like a culmination of all the sad events from 10 years previously.
Bobby Charlton was crying, and you know, your dad tells you why not just because he's won the trophy, but what was around the trophy, what it took to get us there, and what it meant. Do you know what I mean?
But it was still remembered. I mean, Bobby Charlton was probably crying at that night. Very emotional player, Bobby. He probably had the thought of all the lads in his mind, the lads he'd played with and died. A lot of fans about my age we sort of thought, well, you know, Duncan could have been here, Tommy Taylor could have been here, Eddie Coleman could have still been here, that's only like the mid-30s. But it was a fitting tribute to them, I think, for Busby to get into that final and win it for them. I mean, there was no two ways about it. That's who he won it for. And that's the memories of Munich.
Manchester United will always be known as a team that came back like the phoenix from the ashes, surviving and coming together again and building further successful teams.
It's the actual fabric of the club. It's in the club's DNA. I mean, if you talk about, you see memorials all over the country to, you know, people who died in wars and people who have been killed in wars. That's the memorial there to the babes. That's their memorial. They started the build of this club as it is now. This worldwide icon, and you just cannot let those memories go away, because that is where it all started.
You know that if you support Manchester United, those players were representing our club that afternoon when they crashed. They died. You can never ever forget about that. We should never forget it. We should remember it every year. As long as this club exists, Munich will be part of our history.
In my opinion, changed football really, really forever. Players like Duncan Edwards, Tommy Taylor, Roger Byrne, the captain, would have most certainly been part of the 1958 World Cup team, with maybe one or two others as well. And no disrespect to Bobby Moore, Duncan Edwards could have played for another 10 years at least, 12 years more even. And
you know, to say now that we're coming up to the 60th anniversary, it's just like a blink of an eye. So if you're like in your 20s and your 25s just now, just, you know, make the most of what you've got, make the most of what the team's got, make the most of Manchester United, learn the history. Because I've been brought up with Manchester United, I know all the history, but if you don't know it, study it. It's basically the fabric of the club.
On our website, Life the Basic Manual, you can find a poem there that I wrote recently to commemorate the occasion, and specifically mentions the 8 players that were lost in the crash. A little bit about their backgrounds, their abilities, and just a few words on their performances.